In a quiet, isolated village surrounded by vast forests, lived a woman named Eleanor Montgomery. Her home was small but cozy, tucked away at the edge of a dense forest. For years, she had lived alone in this modest house, except for her loyal dog, Max, a large shepherd who had been her companion for over a decade. Eleanor's life was simple. Her days revolved around the rhythms of nature and the peace she found in solitude. But one cold evening in late autumn, that tranquility was shattered by the sudden barking of her dog. Max had always been an alert and protective companion, but tonight, his barking was different, frantic, urgent. Eleanor, concerned, quickly threw on her woolen shawl and hurried outside. Following the sound of his sharp barks, the wind rustled through the tall grass, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the yard. Max was standing near the barn, his body tense and his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "What is it, Max?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with concern as she stepped closer. Max barked again, this time louder, as if urging her to hurry. Eleanor followed his gaze and saw a strange figure near the barn, a large animal, wounded, lying in the shadows. The sight of it took her breath away. At first, Eleanor thought it was a deer, but as she drew closer, she realized it was a wolf, a gray, powerful creature with wild, amber eyes. The wolf was lying on the ground, its sides heaving with labored breaths, its body covered in blood and dirt. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched down to examine the animal more closely. "Poor thing," she muttered softly, her eyes filled with compassion. The wolf didn't flinch as she approached, and its intense gaze seemed to plead with her. Eleanor's thoughts raced. How had it ended up here? What had happened to it? She knew the forest was full of dangers, but she couldn't ignore the wolf's suffering. Max stood silently by her side. His usual protective stance softened, as if he too understood the gravity of the situation. Eleanor carefully reached out to touch the wolf's fur, noting the warmth of its body despite the obvious signs of injury. She had always respected the wild, but she had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely a murmur. She knew that the village would consider her actions foolish if anyone found out. After all, wolves were considered a threat to the livestock, and the villagers would likely see this as just another predator to eliminate. But Eleanor wasn't like the others. She didn't see the wolf as a threat. She saw it as a creature in need of help. She gently examined the wolf's wounds, noticing that one of its legs was badly injured. It must have been hurt in a recent skirmish, perhaps from a hunter's trap or an encounter with another animal. The blood was dried and dark, but the wolf was still breathing, though weakly. Max let out a soft whine, his eyes full of concern as Eleanor carefully cradled the wolf's head. She knew she couldn't just leave the animal here, alone and suffering. She needed to help it, even if it meant going against the town's expectations. Eleanor stood up and walked back to the house, her mind racing with ideas. She was no veterinarian, but she knew enough about first aid to tend to the wolf's injuries. She fetched some clean cloths and a bottle of antiseptic from the cabinet. Max followed her closely, his quiet presence a source of comfort. As Eleanor carefully cleaned the wolf's wounds and bandaged its leg, she couldn't help but think about her own life. She had been alone for so long, ever since her husband, Henry, had passed away many years ago. He had been a kind man, a carpenter by trade, but he had always loved the outdoors as much as she did. The two of them had spent many quiet days in the woods together, walking, hunting, and marveling at the beauty of the land. But when Henry died unexpectedly, Eleanor was left to carry on alone. The grief had been overwhelming, and for years, she had withdrawn into herself. Max had been her only true companion, and though she cherished his company, she often found herself yearning for the connections she once had. But now, with this wolf in front of her, Eleanor felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just helping an animal, she was giving it a second chance, and in a way, it felt like the wolf had brought her back to life. As she finished tending to the wolf, Eleanor carefully lifted it into her arms, wincing at its weight but determined to care for it. She carried it into the small barn next to her house, where she had set up a makeshift bed of blankets and hay. The wolf collapsed onto the ground with a soft whine. Its breathing still shallow but steadier. "I'll keep you safe," Eleanor whispered, her heart heavy with the responsibility she had just taken on. She had no idea what the future would hold for her and the wolf. But one thing was clear: she couldn't let it suffer. She would care for it, as long as it needed her. As days passed, Eleanor's bond with the injured wolf grew stronger. She named it Ash, as its coat reminded her of the gray shadows that flickered in the corners of her memories. The wolf was a silent companion, never once resisting Eleanor's help, even when she applied ointments to its wounds or changed its bandages. Each time, its amber eyes met hers with an unspoken understanding that somehow soothed her aching heart. Ash's condition gradually improved. The limp in its leg began to ease, and the deep, dark wounds started to heal. Though the scars remained, Eleanor made it her mission to ensure that the wolf would regain its strength. Every morning, she would bring it fresh water and small portions of meat, watching as it slowly regained its appetite. Max, who had initially been uncertain about the newcomer, now accepted Ash's presence, though he kept a cautious eye on the wolf. There were moments of tenderness between them. Ash would nuzzle Max's fur, and Max, after a long period of wariness, would respond with a wag of his tail. But while the wolf was recovering physically, Eleanor couldn't ignore the growing unease she felt in her chest. She knew that the villagers, especially the hunters, would never accept her decision to shelter the wolf. It had become clear to her that the wolf's presence was a dangerous secret, one that, if discovered, would likely lead to its destruction. The village had always held a certain fear and disdain for the wild animals of the forest, and many of the local farmers had been vocal in their complaints about the increasing number of wolves in the area. One afternoon, as Eleanor was returning from the village with a bag of supplies, she overheard a heated conversation between two of the local farmers, Simeon and Igor, just outside the tavern. Their voices were loud, and they seemed unaware that Eleanor was standing only a few feet away. "I tell you, the wolves are getting bolder," Simeon's voice rang out. "They're killing our sheep every night. If something isn't done soon, they'll be taking cattle next. Someone needs to take action. They've been killing our livestock for weeks now." Igor responded with a harsh tone. "The problem is worse than ever. It's not just a few here and there anymore. It's a full-on invasion. And you know what? I'm tired of waiting for the authorities to do something. If they won't act, we will. We've got enough guns and hunters between us." Eleanor's stomach turned as she listened to the conversation. She knew exactly what they were planning. A group of armed men would take to the forests, hunting down the wolves, destroying them as if they were pests to be exterminated. And Ash was no doubt on their list. But there was something more, something that made her freeze in place as she continued to listen. "We'll catch them in the act," Simeon said. "If we're lucky, we'll even find that she-wolf with her pups. Imagine how much we'll earn from the pelt alone. I've heard rumors that she's a big one, the leader of the pack." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The she-wolf, the one she had been taking care of, the one who had trusted her. It was all becoming too real, too dangerous. She quickly ducked behind a nearby cart and listened until the men's voices faded, their plans taking root in her mind like poison. The fate of Ash and her pups seemed sealed. There was no way Eleanor could allow this to happen. No way she could just stand by and watch as these hunters tore apart the family she had grown so attached to. That night, after feeding Ash and Max, Eleanor sat by the fire in her small living room. Deep in thought, she stared at the flames flickering in the hearth, the crackling sound doing little to ease the tension that gripped her chest. She couldn't stay here forever, hiding the truth from the village. If she didn't act soon, the hunters would be upon them, and the consequences would be catastrophic. As she mulled over her options, a thought occurred to her. She had lived in this village for many years, and while the people were wary of her, there was one person who had always been kind to her, and more importantly, someone who had known her late husband, Victor. His name was Sergei, and he was a forester, someone who lived on the outskirts of the village. After Victor's death, Sergei had become a kind of confidant for Eleanor. Though they hadn't spoken much in recent months, Eleanor had always trusted Sergei's judgment, and he had been a close friend of Victor's, especially in their younger years. Sergei knew the woods like the back of his hand, and he had always respected the balance of nature. Perhaps he could help her find a way to protect Ash and the pups, to stop the hunters before it was too late. The next day, Eleanor made her decision. She packed a small bag of provisions and set out for Sergei's cabin, her heart pounding with the weight of the situation. It was a long walk through the forest, and the wind had picked up, rustling the trees above her head. The quiet of the woods felt suffocating, but Eleanor pushed forward, determined to find some kind of solution. When she arrived at Sergei's cabin, she found him outside chopping wood. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow as he leaned on the axe. "Eleanor," he said warmly, offering a nod. "It's been a while. What brings you here?" Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I need your help, Sergei. There's something happening in the village, something I can't handle alone. It's about the wolves." Sergei's expression darkened. "I suspected as much," he muttered. "The hunters, I presume?" Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "They're coming for them, Sergei. They know about Ash, and they're planning to kill her and her pups. I can't let that happen." Sergei sighed, his face etched with concern. "I knew the day would come when someone would try to kill them off. The wolves have always been a part of this land, but people never seem to understand them." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, Sergei, you know what it means to respect nature. Can you help me find a way to stop this before it's too late?" Sergei's eyes softened as he regarded her. "I've been thinking about this for a while. The wolves are part of the balance here, Eleanor. If we let the hunters do what they're planning, it could ruin everything. But there's a way to stop them. I have an idea, though it won't be easy." Eleanor listened intently as Sergei outlined his plan. He was going to use his knowledge of the forest and the wolf pack's movements to lead the hunters away, to outsmart them and give Ash and her pups a chance to escape. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was their best shot. And so, they set their plan into motion. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. She wasn't alone in this fight, and together, they would protect the wolves. The next morning, Eleanor set out early with Sergei. They had carefully mapped out a plan to divert the hunters away from the wolves, using the forest to their advantage. With Sergei's deep knowledge of the terrain, they moved swiftly, avoiding the usual paths the hunters would take. The dense forest was quiet in the early hours of the day, with only the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot as they made their way deeper into the woods. Eleanor's thoughts were consumed by the image of Ash, lying there in her cabin with her pups, vulnerable. She couldn't bear the thought of them falling into the hands of those ruthless hunters. Her heart raced as the enormity of the task before them settled in. This wasn't just about saving Ash, it was about ensuring the survival of something much larger, an entire ecosystem. A fragile balance that depended on the wolves. Sergei glanced at her, his face grim but determined. "We'll need to be quick. If we can lead them away from Ash's den, we'll give them a chance to escape. But the hunters won't stop until they get what they want." Eleanor nodded. "I know. That's why we can't fail." They reached a high ridge that overlooked a clearing, and Sergei paused, scanning the area. "This is where we'll start. We'll set a few traps along the way to mislead them, but we'll need to move fast." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What about the wolves?" "Leave that to me," Sergei said, his voice calm. "You stay out of sight and don't let anyone see you. If we do this right, we can outsmart them." They began the first part of their plan, leading the hunters on a wild goose chase. Sergei had spent years studying the forest, knowing every curve of the land, every hidden trail. He set subtle diversions, faint tracks that led in the wrong direction, confusing scents, and faint echoes to mislead the hunters. With each step, Eleanor could feel the tension building. Time was running out. Back at the cabin, Ash lay with her pups, her large form curled protectively around them. The mother wolf was alert but tired. Her once vibrant coat was dull from exhaustion, but she would not leave her babies. Eleanor knew that if Ash sensed danger, she would do anything to protect her pups, even if it meant putting herself in harm's way. As the day wore on, the sounds of the hunt grew louder. Gunshots rang in the distance, and the ground vibrated with the sound of boots crunching through the underbrush. Sergei signaled for Eleanor to stay low. They were close now. Too close. He motioned to a nearby thicket where they could hide for a moment. Once they're past us, we'll make our move, Sergei whispered, his eyes narrowing in concentration. If we can get them to the trap zone, we'll have a chance. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Every moment felt like an eternity. She could hear the hunters now, their voices growing louder as they approached. It wouldn't be long before they realized they'd been led on a wild chase. But as they neared the clearing, something unexpected happened. Eleanor's heart stopped when she saw the figures of the hunters emerging from the trees. They had split up, more aggressive than she had anticipated, and some of them were headed directly towards Ash's den. They weren't following the false trail as Sergei had hoped. Instead, they were closing in on their target. No, Eleanor gasped, her voice trembling with panic. She couldn't let them get to Ash. Not now. Sergei acted immediately, his instincts kicking in. We have to move. Now. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the clearing, his movements swift and purposeful. Eleanor followed closely, her heart hammering in her chest. They had to reach the wolves before the hunters did. The moment they reached the edge of the clearing, Sergei spotted Ash and her pups just ahead. Emerging from their den, the mother wolf looked exhausted but alert. Her amber eyes locked on Eleanor as if she recognized her. But there was no time for sentiment now. Eleanor motioned for Ash to move quickly. We're here. Ash, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the wind. It's time to go. Ash hesitated for only a moment, then turned and trotted toward Eleanor, the pups trailing closely behind her. Eleanor's heart soared at the sight of them, but her joy was short-lived when she heard the hunters' voices growing louder. They're almost here, Sergei said, his voice tight with urgency. We need to get them out of here. Eleanor looked at the wolves. They're beautiful, fragile lives hanging in the balance. The pups, though small and weak, moved quickly, staying close to their mother. Eleanor turned to Sergei. Can you distract them? She asked, her voice shaking with the weight of what she was asking. I can, Sergei said with a determined nod. But you have to be quick. Without another word, Sergei darted toward the hunters, his figure blending into the trees as he moved swiftly. Eleanor wasted no time. She turned and hurried the wolves toward a hidden trail that would lead them deeper into the forest. The wind howled around them, but Eleanor didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Behind her, the sound of the hunters' pursuit grew closer. They had seen Sergei's movements and were now chasing him through the woods. But it didn't matter. The wolves had a chance, and Eleanor wasn't going to let anyone take it away from them. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small stream where the wolves could rest. Eleanor paused for a moment, gasping for air, and turned to see Sergei emerge from the trees, his face grim but triumphant. It's done, he said, his voice heavy with relief. They're gone. The wolves are safe. Eleanor looked at Ash, her heart swelling with gratitude. You did it, she whispered. Thank you. Sergei smiled. It's not over yet, but this fight, at least, we've won. As the days passed, the hunters were forced to abandon their pursuit of the wolves, but the village would never forget what had happened. The incident spread like wildfire, and many of the villagers began to question the way they treated the animals that lived in the forest. Some of them, inspired by Eleanor's actions, began to push for greater protection of the wildlife in the area. Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The wolves would continue to roam free, but the fight for their survival had only just begun. In time, Eleanor would not only protect the wolves, but also find solace in the bonds she had formed, in the quiet moments shared with the wild, and in the knowledge that sometimes, standing up for what is right meant risking everything. For now, though, she could rest easy knowing that Ash and her pups were safe, and that, in the end, nature had been allowed to survive.